Welcome. Thank you for coming to our tonight's presentation, Evolving Sunnyvale, which is co-hosted by Sunnyvale Cool, Friends of Caltrain, and the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. This presentation is made possible by a grant from the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. We're really pleased that Erik Calloway is able to share his knowledge and experience with us tonight. Mr. Calloway is a principal of Freedman, Tung Sasaki, a well-respected forward-looking urban design firm that's actually working on our Perry Park specific plan. He earned a BA in architecture with an additional focus on urban design and sustainability issues from Yale University. His current focus is strategically restructuring cities to align with the innovation-oriented economy. Mr. Calloway's work makes him very familiar with the Bay Area in general and the peninsula in particular, having worked on an economic and housing opportunities assessment of El Camino Real for the Grand Boulevard Initiative. He's managed a wide range of award-winning projects, including the Redwood City, California Downtown Precise Plan, the Bothell, Washington Downtown Sub-Area Plan, and the Beach and Edinger Corridor Specific Plan in Huntington Beach, California. Most recently, he led the adoption of a General Plan Update and Corridor Specific Plan in Sonoma, California. He also contributed to the adopted Downtown Livermore Specific Plan and built streetscape designs for First Street in Livermore and Pluma Street in Yuba City. Please welcome Erik Calloway.
Thank you, Barbara. First, I'd just like to thank the co-hosts and the funder for setting this up. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited that we have such a good turnout. Hopefully I won't bore you to death over the next hour. My name is Erik Calloway. As she said, I am a principal with Freedman, Tung Sasaki. We're an urban design consulting firm. We do urban design, public realm, district and city strategies, and land use and development regulations. But our overall approach is to make sure that we're always clear about current trends so that we understand not just how cities are changing, but why cities are changing. And I expect that a lot of you are here tonight because you know that the world has changed. We look around and see climate change, oil price instability, raising gas prices, foreclosure crises, credit crises, financial market instability, government budget crises, and it makes us uncomfortable because we want stability. We want things to be familiar to us, and it makes us uncomfortable with all of this change. But the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, that city change is not the exception, it's the norm. Cities change over time, they do. But the good news is that we can understand what's going on by gaining a little bit of perspective on where we are, how we got to where we are, and how those trends might be leading to where we're going. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of a look back to gain a little bit of perspective on where we are and see if we can get some understanding and become a little bit more comfortable with what is going on in the world today. So if we look back to the up until the late 19th century, for several thousand years, communities were small, they were spread out, they were self-sufficient, they were primarily agriculturally oriented. Then in the late 19th, early 20th century, work was mechanized, and then it was reorganized around assembly lines. So we went from muscle power and individual craftsman work to mechanized, synchronized, low-skill labor that was organized. Work was broken down into component tasks, and it was set up along an assembly line, and that really facilitated efficient work. It facilitated mass production. So it was a way of organizing our work activity. And what happened when we organized work around the assembly line is that we got widespread urbanization. So all those people who were spread out across the country in these small communities who were no longer needed for agricultural work, they moved to cities where the factory labor was needed. And so there was widespread urbanization, and cities all of a sudden, just out of the blue, became massive, massive cities, bigger than anything that anyone had ever seen before. And when city planners of the early 20th century saw all this prosperity that was being generated by this new way of work, they saw these new technologies, they saw these new cities and these huge urban conglomerations, they specifically decided that cities should be reorganized. The cities, the way we were planning and building cities in the past, didn't fit with the way that we were working, with the way the economy worked. And so they deliberately reorganized cities around these industrial principles. They broke the city down into places where we work, and into places where we shop, and into places where we live, and then they connected them with conveyor belts of roads that took advantage of the new car technology at the time. They did this deliberately. Sunnyvale's first general plan in 1954 to 57 was indicative of that new kind of planning, where we broke the city down into housing areas, working areas, and shopping areas, and the housing areas were centered on public space and civic facilities, and the work areas were focused primarily on access, primarily rail access. And so, in between World War I and World War II, there was a lull in construction activity. And coming out of World War II, there was a huge pent-up demand for new development. And people wanted this new modern lifestyle, this new suburban lifestyle. So, Sunnyvale's population grew almost 500%, just significant amounts of new population. And so, since everybody wanted to live this way, essentially what we were doing is we were mass-producing suburbs on a massive scale across the country. So when we combine this huge population growth with this mass production and mass consumption society, then the retail followed all these new customers out into the suburbs. We have all these customers, and then we have all these things that they want to buy. And so the retail followed them out. And it was typically located along arterial corridors, which is where the retail was zoned for that kind of development to be located. And that was what created the Strip. The Strip consists of primarily freestanding, auto-oriented, surface park retail development. And it's located out on the big wide roads where all the people are driving by in their cars, so that's where the customers are. And then the roads got bigger and bigger, and we started building the interstate highway system beginning in the 1950s. And the result of that was retail started clustering in larger and larger concentrations as well, until in the 80s and 90s we were building regional malls at about 20 malls per year in the United States. Again, Sunnyvale Town Center in 1979 is an example of this period of mall building. And similar to some other communities that built their mall in their downtown area, that mall was never necessarily as successful as it might have been envisioned because it didn't have one of the primary characteristics that most successful regional malls have. It wasn't located at a freeway interchange. So in terms of work in the early 20th century, these new industrial facilities they needed to be really large in order to fit the new equipment, in order to justify the significant cost of investment in these new facilities. And so they really generally only fit on the outskirts of existing cities or in new industrial suburbs along existing or planned rail lines. And Sunnyvale has always been a very forward-looking city driven by industry, a city of destiny, a manufacturing center. And so in the early 1900s, Sunnyvale was conceived as one of these industrial suburbs along the lines of those modeled off of those in the Great Lakes region near outside of Chicago. But of course, the type of work that we did changed over time. So from the 60s through the 80s, the suburban workplace that we were building was more business parks, corporate campuses, and edge cities. This type of workplace is characterized by low-density, auto-oriented development. It's generally a large area of single use. There aren't really any activity centers in these business parks or central business districts. There's a lot of landscaping. Landscaping was actually a key characteristic of these business parks in terms of what they were intended to do to attract talent. They were modeled off of kind of the university campus model. and they were generally fairly inwardly focused. So when we look around us today, we look at the city of Sunnyvale, and we see that we pretty much got what we planned for. This is from the current general plan, where we see where housing development is in the city, we see where workplace development is in the city. Of course, we know that that retail is concentrated along El Camino Real and downtown. So we pretty much got what we planned for, and that's not a bad thing, because it generated a lot of prosperity, and it created the community that we know and love today. So this experiment of new city building, where we separated our lives into work areas and shopping areas and housing areas, it was an experiment. It was a new way of building cities, but it fit extremely well with the industrial economy of the era. And the main thing that I want you to take away from this is that when the nature of work changes, the cities that we live in are entirely transformed. But of course, we don't live in the same world that we lived in when those ideas were first generated. Things have changed since the early 20th century. First, the financial foundation of commercial strip development has disappeared. In 1954, the IRS changed commercial building depreciation from 40 years to 7 years. It significantly incentivized the construction of low-cost buildings with short lifetimes. But then in 1986, they returned the commercial building depreciation back to 39 years. So that was a major change in terms of the type of development that was incentivized. Similarly, these larger and larger concentrations of retail, as retail investment moved from downtowns to strip corridors to large crossroads-oriented shopping centers, these centers have been draining economic vitality from other locations. Yet even those large concentrations of retail regional malls, as of 2011, for the first time, there were 0 malls under construction anywhere in the United States. That was the first time since the 1950s. A big reason for that are internet sales have been growing 3 times faster than brick and mortar sales. That includes new, essentially internet-only establishments like Amazon, Netflix, and eBay. It includes previously brick and mortar stores that do a lot of internet sales, that have added internet sales to the way that they sell things. And then we have kind of hybrid organizations like maybe J. Crew or Victoria's Secret, which is essentially a new internet version of catalog shopping. So in this rapidly evolving and really oversupplied real estate universe, but real estate and development professionals recognize that most areas simply need less retail, not more retail. And endless strip construction is certainly over. So these are some major changes in retail that when we look at our cities, this is fairly typical of a city that shows where retail zoned land is. And so all of this land, essentially, you're only allowed to build retail on it. This is all retail zoned land in the city of Pomona, which is significantly more land available than the actual supportable pattern of retail centers in the city. And so the result that we get out of this is we get a lot of disinvested land and land that's ready for change, vacant land that never had the demand, it's not well positioned for retail, and there just isn't the demand for that kind of development. Also, buildings with low site coverage or obsolete formats that were built in the early stages of strip corridor development, and they don't really match up with current retail trends. And then, of course, we've changed how we get around our cities. In 1950, people traveled on average about 10 miles per day. That's only about the distance from here to Santa Clara and back. And that makes sense because up through 1950, communities remained relatively compact. We can see here Sunnyvale in the early 20th century, and we have workplace areas on the edge of town, and we have downtown. There's probably some workplace in there, and we have kind of housing surrounding that. It's not a really particularly large community. We don't have to go very far. Of course, we saw that significant population growth that we talked about from 1950 to 1970, but on top of that, even that population growth has been dwarfed by vehicle growth in the United States, where the vehicle growth rate has grown about 1.5 times the population growth rate. So to the point today, people drive on average about 40 miles per day, and that's about the distance from here to San Mateo and back. So we've essentially learned to associate all of that growth with degraded mobility. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We could have had all that population growth and everybody is walking and then we don't have to sit in traffic. So the real question is, why are we actually driving so much? And the myth is Americans drive so much because we're a car culture. We like to drive, we like our cars, we're not going to change, I don't want to get rid of my car, I love it. But the fact of the matter is that we actually drive in response to the pattern of land use and development that we talked about. So when we separate where we live from where we shop and where we work, and we're going from here to each of those locations, that takes 6 trips to get there and back to each of those locations. But an alternative way to do it would be if all 3 of those destinations were all in one place where we could park once and then walk, then all of a sudden we only have 2 trips, we're going to the same number of destinations. Or similarly, if we have a more if instead of having to go from work to school, we have to all get on this same collector road, if we have more of a connected network that gives us options about how to get from point A to point B, we can have actually more vehicular capacity on our street network and also smaller streets. And we also know, the data shows very clearly that as communities become more compact, the demand for transit increases. As density increases, vehicle ownership decreases, and vehicle miles traveled decreases. There are significant changes in housing market. We're all well aware of the record number of foreclosures and slow sales and construction since 2008, foreclosure activity, housing starts, and existing home sales. We're also well aware that accounted for almost 1/3 of the foreclosures nationally, all in California. But when you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that change in housing demand, that foreclosure activity, was not evenly distributed across the nation, state, or even across a region. You can see that in the Los Angeles region, in central Los Angeles, there was one foreclosure for maybe about every 600 homes. And out in outer Riverside County, there was one foreclosure at one point and up to about every 50 homes. So there was a significantly different impact in this change in housing demand. What this really shows us is that urban locations have been holding value better than suburban and exurban locations. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend you read The Option of Urbanism by Christopher Lineberger. And he points out that nationally, housing prices in walkable urban locations have about a 3-fold premium, up to a 3-fold premium over drivable single-family housing. And this is a significant shift in values that has occurred over the last several decades. So the question is, with all these changes in terms of how and where we shop in the retail market, how and where we live, and how we get around, does the 20th century approach to city building that we talked about fit with the new economy that we're living in today? So let's take a look at how we create value in today's economy. First, we're, of course, widespread and rapid digitalization. So the assembly line hasn't gone anywhere, but there's significantly less physical, low-skilled labor needed for assembly line activities. And of course, that varies depending on where the manufacturing is occurring. But even in places where there is a relatively decent amount of physical labor involved, there's still highly automated assembly lines. And then we've also replaced some physical things with digital things or augmented them. So information storage becoming digital means that we need less space to store goods. And we also have significantly more data about how we live and how we shop and how we work. In fact, think about it for a second. As of 1950, essentially 0% of information was digital. And by 2007, 94% of our information is stored in digital capacity. And not only that, but if you compare, say 1751 French encyclopedia with Wikipedia, the amount of information that we have available to us has just exploded. And at first, a lot of people thought that this digitalization was just a change in tools. So instead of people sitting around on typewriters, they sat around on computers. And instead of going to the post office to send a letter, you'd send an email. But the fact of the matter is that we've seen fundamental changes in the way that we work because of digitalization. With significantly less labor needed to make and move things, people can spend a lot more time thinking and strategizing and analyzing, and when they do it, they can use their computers and these new tools in order to think and strategize and analyze in new ways. So what do? Well, we sit and we think about how to combine a phone with radio waves to create cell phones, or how to combine phones with computers to create the internet, or how to combine cell phones with the internet to create smartphones. And this process of adding existing ideas together to create new ideas is the process of innovation, and this process of innovation is what's the primary wealth generator in the economy today. Sasaki Sassen, well-known sociologist at Columbia and the London School of Economics, points out this isn't just about software and design, so don't think it's just computers. It's also about mining and agriculture. It's about all industries. Here's a tortilla factory in San Leandro that we talked to. We found out that they were having trouble because they didn't have the skilled software and food science professionals that they needed to expand the way that they wanted. Or if you look at computer use by industry, you can see that farming, fishing, and forestry employees use 11% of them, or agricultural-related industries, 20% of agricultural-related employees use computers on a daily basis. This is back in 2003, so I'm sure that that's changed significantly. And to me, that's just mind-blowing, that 20% of people who work in agricultural industry are using a computer on a daily basis. Linda Grattan, management professor, points out, and I believe her in this case, we're witnessing now a break in the past as significant as that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when we began the process of industrialization. And we just went through how that change in work affected the cities that we lived in. So if innovation is going to have such a significant effect on how we live and how our cities function and how our cities are planned, let's take a little bit of a closer look at innovation itself and learn from the best Silicon Valley here, where a lot of this started. So we're going to take a step back again. In the early 1900s, the Bay Area economy was centered around San Francisco. It was a major financial center, and it was a hub of trade, primarily maritime trade. There wasn't a lot of manufacturing here. The manufacturing that we had was primarily regional serving manufacturing. What we did have, especially because of all the maritime, the boat activity, there's a lot of radio activity. So we had amateur radio hobbyists, ham radio. And this was the ham radio hobbyists. There's a culture of information sharing and experimentation, technical innovation with their radio equipment. And what that experimentation led to was the vacuum tube industry. You may know at the time electronics were vacuum tubes. And so they developed high-tech manufacturing processes, and there was a significant focus on the relationship between research, engineering, and production. Of course, there were major customers here for vacuum tubes, NASA and Lockheed Martin, among others, who bought and funded a lot of this research and bought these products. Then in the 50s and 60s, the semiconductor industry moved in. And how the semiconductor industry was successful in Silicon Valley was that it built off of the high-tech manufacturing processes and actually were supplied by the vacuum tube industry and the equipment that they used in order to create semiconductors, because semiconductor manufacturing, you need to do it in a vacuum. And so the high-tech vacuum equipment that was available from the industry that was in place really helped serve the semiconductor industry. The semiconductor industry did a lot of innovation in management techniques and collaborative organizational structures. So they focused a lot on sharing ideas and making sure that people had the ability to develop their ideas. And they were so successful in doing so that they created the integrated circuit industry as spin-off companies from semiconductor industries. And these integrated circuit industries created new markets that we could build off of. But importantly, they drew from the pool of talented and skilled semiconductor workers that were available in the region. And then in the 80s, building off of the tradition of amateur radio enthusiasts, we now have this kind of complex network of electronics component people, electronic component companies, and they start putting these pieces together and we get personal computers. So built on the established regional electronics components industries in the region. And of course, today we have the software industry, which is continuing to build on the tradition of entrepreneurship and innovative technologies and changing workplaces. So when we look at this procession from no manufacturing to Silicon Valley, what we see is that the success was built off an accumulation of local skills and unique knowledge that was available only in the region. It was built on existing strengths. It leveraged heavily synergy between research, design, and engineering, and it drew from a skilled labor pool that was available in the region. And this makes a lot of sense because with all this information that we have out there, this sea of information that we kind of have to wade through every day, we need people in order to find content, and then we use content to find people that can help us work through our ideas. So innovation is a social process. It absolutely requires group collaboration, and it also requires sharing of ideas from people that have different specializations, different skills, different experiences, and different perspectives. So one of our essential principles here is that innovation requires settings that bring people together to share ideas, to collaborate, and to exchange ideas face to face. So that's partially in the workplace, in offices and labs and conference rooms, but it's also outside the workplace, in cafes and bars, during breaks, recreation, really anywhere where socializing occurs. We can see this pretty dramatically in this map here by Eric Fisher. He does some fantastic stuff. This shows Twitter and Flickr use. Twitter is blue, Flickr is orange, and white is both. And you can just see the conversation going on in downtown San Francisco. But aside from that bright white, that I'm not going to talk a lot about, but digital engagement, infusing our physical places with the digital technologies that we have become so familiar with. So we can go onto Google Maps and find a lot of stuff about where we live, but we can't bring the information of Google Maps necessarily out into the places where we live. This is something that is very new, though. So if we look at some good examples like Facebook's campus, actually the central space on Facebook's campus is a very good example of a kind of public space that is well integrated with their campus buildings. But when we look at Facebook, or we look at Google's campus, or we look at VMware's campus and these nice public spaces here, we have to recognize that this is what these campuses look like from the outside. They're not very well integrated with their surrounding communities, which means that they're not providing a lot of benefit directly to those surrounding areas, and they're not gaining a lot of benefit from their immediate surroundings. We know that this is possible to do as a campus. This is Amazon's campus in South Lake Union, Seattle. You see it from the inside, very similar. It looks like a nice public space, but it's very well integrated in urban location, so it is possible to do it. VMware's campus, for those of you who are aware of walk score, has a 98 walk score, has a 90 transit score. I'm sorry, Amazon's campus. VMware has 26 and Facebook has 31. Google does pretty well with 69. I think that's because they have a lot of restaurants and stuff that show up on Google Maps that you can't actually go to. South Park in San Francisco is an excellent example of how, if you build the bones, it can evolve well over time with what happens. South Park, there was a lot of housing around here. Now there's still a bunch of housing around South Park, but there's some restaurants and cafes, there's some offices, there's an architecture firm. It's surrounded by some larger office development in both industrial conversions and new office buildings. But the park space itself is used by everybody. And it's available for everybody, and it really makes it a place that people want to live and work. South Park, for comparison, has a walk score of 89 and a transit score of 100, which is good for convenience living, which is the final thing that we need to plan for, convenience living. We've really seen a decline in the drive until you can buy mentality. At least since 2010, smaller units close to mass transit, work, and 24-hour amenities were gaining favor over larger houses on big lots in the suburbs. It continues to be the case. Infill development, shifting away from the suburbs to more urban lifestyles remains hot. One of the main reasons for this is because of the purchasing power of millennials. The 19 to 37-year-olds who are either coming out of college and looking for an apartment to live in, or they're buying their first home. CEO for City survey of 25 to 34-year-old graduates show that almost 2/3 of them pick where they want to live before they start looking for a job, and they're 90% more likely to live in close-in urban neighborhoods. Google, Facebook, they run some of the largest private shuttle companies in the world because their employees don't want to live in these kinds of environments. They want to live in places like Soma in Mission District in San Francisco, where they can walk to a cafe and they can walk to a corner store to buy eggs, and there's a park that they can hang out with their friends in, and there's nightlife. So this, what we call the creative class, they crave vital centers for their living, working, and recreation environments, all aspects of their life. Transit is important to them, activity and street life is important to them, public space is important to them. These vital centers are attractive to compact households, so since in 1970 almost half of households had children. As of 2000 that had changed significantly, about 2/3 of households don't have children. By 2030 it's projected that about 3/4 of households won't have children. That goes along with the fact that these vital centers are attractive to empty nesters. That's the boomer generation where their kids no longer live with them either. And they are generally looking to downsize their home. They're looking for the same kind of convenience living. So in order to accommodate these, we need housing and lifestyle choices. We can't have one type of housing and lifestyle. And the places in Sunnyvale that could potentially accommodate these kinds of lifestyles, maybe along El Camino Real, will potentially feature and improve transit in and around downtown, close to your train stations, and potentially considering in and around workplace districts. In order to support that convenience lifestyle, you need to have a mobility network that goes along with it. The traditional central city model, where we had a lot of residential commuter suburbs around the central city, and then we drove from work on the freeway in order to get to our business park or our central business district. Now we have more of a polycentric metropolis, so this whole regional entrepreneurial economy is composed of sub-regional units here that rely on the enhancement of those individual local places. This is playing out in the data. We can see that for 8 straight years. Luckily, vehicle miles traveled has been declining fairly steadily, both per capita vehicle miles traveled and total in the United States. We also, it sounds mundane, but you have to have transit in order for people to use transit. You can see in black here that in all these regions what percentage of the commute is in transit. So in the Bay Area, a little over 10% of people use transit to get to work. But if you're within a half a mile of a station, a little over 30% of people use transit to get to work. So you have to have the transit in order for people to use the transit. But you also have to have it in the places that connect people where people want to get from and where people want to get to. And when people get to and from work has changed. In the early 20th century, we had the synchronized workday. It came from that industrialization assembly line mentality. People come in, you're all clocking in for work at the same time, you clock out for lunch at the same time, you clock out at the end of the day at the same time in that 9 to 5 job. That's just not the case as much anymore today. You have people check their work after they get up, they check their email at home before they go to work. Maybe they run an errand, they have a late lunch. They go to the gym at the end of the day, they do a little bit more work before they go home, they check their email after they get home. So this peak commute time that we're used to has been spread out. So not everyone is moving at the same time. But even though commute has a significant impact on how we think about traffic, because everyone feels like they're stuck in commute traffic, the fact of the matter is that actually over 70% of all trips are for family, personal, and recreational reasons. These types of trips are convenience driven. They generally are shorter trips, 8 miles on average for school, shopping, personal business, social, recreational. And more actually I like to think about it in terms of time. These are the types of trips that you don't want them to be over 15 minutes long, say. So in order to provide this kind of convenience lifestyle, we need to provide transit-connected hubs of activity. We need to have places where there's transit access, and you either live there or you work there, there's activity there, but they connect other places where people live, work, or have activity in order for that transit to be used, and in order to provide the kinds of living environments that we talked about in terms of compact lifestyles, compact households, in terms of activity. So all these are kind of tools that aren't really new. In terms of where land uses go, how much density you build, what's the transit infrastructure, and I call that activity plus good urbanism. And it goes a long way towards getting us what we want, but it doesn't get us everything that we want. To be really successful in the new economy, cities have to do a little bit more than that. So that requires a little bit more perspective here. In the 20th century, the assembly line economy, economic value was created by these large firms. They would build infrastructure. A lot of these large companies even built rail spurs and rail lines. That's a lot of infrastructure to build. They attracted talent. They were responsible for attracting talent and training that talent. They trained their employees. They provided benefits. So cities could pretty much kind of sit back, provide a little bit of incentives maybe, but just attract those large firms and let the large firms do their job. Some changes have happened. The scale and complexity of business operations has increased dramatically. We have global companies. This is Wrigley's corporate facilities and principal associated companies, which means that they're not doing all of that work themselves. So whereas we used to have production, dispatch, warehousing, social clubs, silos, administration, marketing, all management, all under one roof, say, originally within one building, but then under one corporation. Now, like we said, we have this network. Services are being provided outside the company. So we've seen extremely sharp growth in producer services. This is the advertising, consulting, accounting, design, engineering, services that that are provided to both those large corporations and to the small corporations. In fact, we look here in Silicon Valley, 2006 to 2011, administrative and support services was the only industry sector that saw growth through the 2008 recession, from before through after. It was the only sector that saw growth there. And those industry clusters, the majority of producer service firms, are small and medium-sized firms. 91% of professional, scientific, technical, and other service firms, 58% of employment is employed by those small and medium-sized companies. And even manufacturing, although large manufacturing firms provide a significant percentage of the employment in the manufacturing industry, there are 81% of manufacturing firms are under 100 employees. So CEOs are clear that small and medium-sized firms have become the most dynamic component of the economy. This shows what percentage of them believe that a combination of players partnering together or small and medium-sized companies will drive innovation the most over the next 10 years. So to be successful, we have to actively attract and accommodate small and medium-sized firms, in addition to as much as, if not more than, larger ones. And that's not just because there are a lot of small and medium-sized firms, but because they play a critical role in this innovation process. Some of the most innovative companies you think of, Google, Facebook, and Apple, they're not as innovative as you think, because Picasa, Android, Instagram, Siri, these are the things that you maybe associate with these companies as what they're dealing with. They purchased those innovations from other companies. They either purchased a company that developed it, or they purchased the innovation from that company. So large firms innovate often by purchasing small firms, or by purchasing innovation from small firms. To be successful, we also have to, of course, attract knowledge workers and innovative businesses. We can't have innovation without innovative people. Innovation comes from these social scenes of passionate, connected people. Firms well aware of the talent traffic between Facebook, Apple, Yahoo, Google, the number of people that, if you know anyone that works in any of those companies, how frequently they move from one company to the other, and how many people they know at the other companies. So But we can't rely on the companies to attract that talent. We want our cities to attract that talent. But we also want to move beyond simply attracting that talent, and we want to produce knowledge workers in innovative businesses. The millennials are a do-it-yourself generation. They're into starting their own company, contract work. They want to know how they can make their idea successful. And as a community, we should give them the opportunity to do that. We want to try and provide innovation anchors, institutions that facilitate collaboration, facilitate knowledge exchange, facilitate lifelong learning, and give anyone who wants to the ability to engage in that innovation process, the ability to learn how to start their own company, the ability to learn new skills in order to move into a new industry. And then we also want to try and provide the infrastructure for these entrepreneurs and these innovative businesses. And that doesn't mean just data and transportation. So in the media industry, for example, they use very expensive equipment, and the equipment turns over very quickly. If you're a cameraman, you don't own your own camera when you make movies. You have to get a camera from somebody else. BBC actually just built a new campus, and they don't own the production facilities, so that BBC can focus on creating the content, and the developer who built the campus is the one who owns and manages the production facilities. So things like production facilities for and management for media, things like labs for science, research labs for science and technology industry, QB3 in Berkeley is an example. It's this kind of new infrastructure that can be provided. We want to plan for this coming wave of growth and prosperity. Growth is coming. That's not about anything in particular, except that we have a lot of people and they have babies, and people want to live in the Bay Area. Sunnyvale and the Bay Area are going to continue to grow and change. These are the projections for San Mateo, Santa Clara County growing 28 to 47%. Sunnyvale's general plan identifies 18,000 people by 2025. That's 7,200 housing units by 2025. Employment is on the rise across the Bay Area. We're already back up to our 2008 jobs level. By 2020, we're projected to be back at the early 2000s .com peak. That job growth is driving demand for all kinds of land uses. The national unemployment rate has been steadily declining. The Bay Area is at a little over 5.5%, is well under the national average even. The Bay Area real estate market is strong. In Sunnyvale, median housing prices are back at their 2008 peak levels, and the stock market is at record highs. So things are moving in a positive direction, both nationally and locally, and we just want to recognize these forces that are driving change, the pattern and role of retail, the needs of the innovation economy, demand for walkable urbanism and convenience living, population growth, demographic changes, sustainability. I didn't talk a lot about sustainability. Not because it's not important, it's extremely important to me. The main reason because if you pay attention to what we need to do to respond to the innovation economy, you'll see that it's the exact same things that we need for sustainability: compact, walkable, transit-oriented communities. Cities that align with these global trends will have prime advantage attracting talent and attracting investment. There's plenty of talent and investment to attract out there. So looking to the future, what that means is we need a new approach to economic development and planning. Instead of being passive and focusing exclusively on attracting big vertically oriented firms. Everybody wants to have Google or Apple or Facebook. Well, maybe not everybody wants them, but if you kind of think, well, we just get Google and then we'll be all set. But what we really need to do is we need to physically reshape our entire cities to attract and accommodate innovators, accommodate contemporary lifestyles, and assemble these knowledge districts that foster innovation and produce innovators. We can do that by building on local strengths. Studies show that up to 80% of job growth comes from existing businesses. So if we focus on strengthening existing workplace districts, on existing activity centers and neighborhoods, on strengthening them, and target opportunities related to our existing city assets. Don't take a one-size-fits-all approach. So first and foremost, look at the places where there's potential for change. In Sunnyvale's general plan, they've identified workplace districts, downtown, some places along El Camino Real as places where there's likely for change. And focus on those areas. Don't worry about areas that are stable and doing well. Make sure you consider the existing conditions, what their actual market demand is, and what's actually feasible to build or not feasible to build. But first and foremost, make sure that we plan places for people. Remember that we're planning places for people to live. We're planning our community. So we want to have in our mind types of places, not necessarily land uses. So we're not talking about suburban office parks versus vital workplace centers. This is both office, but they're distinctly different characters. They create distinctly different kinds of communities. When we're talking about multifamily projects or housing subdivisions, we're talking about attractive, walkable neighborhoods. So if we look at our entire city and we identify not everywhere where we have high density, and not everywhere where we have these active activity centers and workplace districts, but we identify where it makes sense and where activity centers will be successful, where transit-oriented districts should be, how they'll be connected to our transit network, where should be urban neighborhoods versus where should be low-density residential neighborhoods, where should be active workplace districts. And if we focus on building places for people, we'll be successful because in this era of specialization, network businesses, digital communication, where people can locate wherever they want to locate, where collaboration is important, where innovation is important, place matters more than ever. Thank you. So we have the lights on. I'm happy to answer questions. I hope you weren't too bored with that. I don't know how much time we have, but we can basically just start answering questions. I think I'll get a hand when we're running out of time, so I'll just pick as the hands go up. Yes?
I live here in Sunnyvale and work in real estate in Palo Alto. One of the big shifts I see going on now that I didn't hear you talk about, you may have, is we have a lot of people from all over the world moving into here. And so we're becoming, in a sense, much more global in our composition, in our interest in food, entertainment, other things. In your look and study at all of this, did you have a sociologist sort of look at the ethnic aspects of and implications for what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons, because I believe that one of the future talks will be about demographics, I cut a little bit back on the demographics. So certainly we're becoming more diverse. I think the easiest way to tie that into what I said is simply to recognize that we want to provide options. We want to provide lifestyle choices. So it's just about, instead of having one lifestyle choice, we want to have different types of housing available. We want to have different types of activity centers available so that anyone who moves to the area can get what it is that they're looking for. Yes?
I think I saw a picture of the new Apple building, the huge round one that they're building, and I think you called it out as being isolated from its environment, and maybe not the best example of urbanism. Did I get that right? And is that a commonly shared opinion? And if so, how come we're building that building?
You know, I thought about putting it in there, putting that picture in there. You know, it's a campus development. It's in the nice landscaped, it's a large landscaped campus is what it is. So it actually aligns very well historically with campuses, which is what the original basis for corporate campuses and business parks was. So I wouldn't necessarily say that like it's evil and there's absolutely nothing correct with it, you know. But in terms of the trends that I am pointing out, it's not very well integrated with what's immediately surrounding it. and both in terms of, in terms of how close it is to various types of uses, and in terms of that central public space amenity being available for the larger community. So from a community perspective, if we're talking about what the community can provide for Apple's campus and what Apple's campus can provide for the community, it's not doing everything, in my opinion, that it could be doing. But,
You ought to write an encyclopedia on this.
I'm working on it.
As the global, the 6 or 7 global areas, how does the community get its hands around that and those issues in a way that perhaps they didn't do entirely in the Apple development, wherever that's going, and where are those discussed? Because I don't see the discussion in the community or the knowledge to make a value judgment on what the city is doing, either what they're asking you, what they're instructing you to do, or what's happening. So it's hard to get a normal person arm around that issue, right? It's very frustrating.
It's a large subject, certainly. So in order to kind of answer those in order, cities have to update their general plans every X number of years.
By law.
Yes. And they don't necessarily, sometimes they update it more frequently, sometimes they update it less frequently. But regardless, at some point, a city will decide that our general plan is out of date, either because a significant amount of change has happened or the ideas in it are out of date. For whatever reason, a city wants to update their general plan. Typically, it's a request for proposal process. They say, we want to update our general plan. Who wants to do our general plan? And consultants like me will submit a proposal, and then they choose who they think is the best. When we do work like that, general plans in particular require a pretty significant amount of public outreach, because you're talking about planning the entire city, as opposed to the project we're working on, Peary Park, which is a specific plan, which is a much more focused portion of the city. So we'll look at all of these issues when we do a general plan. We look at all of these issues when we do any project, essentially. And your last question was about the first two.
How the general public or an individual in the general public evaluate what they're...
Oh, how do they relate? So because general plans are only updated every so often, and they're very long-range plans, that's not necessarily the best tool to use in order to incorporate these ideas. So if you happen to be updating your general plan, it certainly makes a lot of sense to take these into account. But if you just updated your general plan, you're not going to re-update your general plan just because you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So there are lots of opportunities that cities have in order to implement ideas that occur over time. So you might do a Peary Park specific plan where you have a recently updated general plan. We want to look at Peary Park. It's one of our change areas. We weren't necessarily thinking of everything that I listed, but when somebody comes in to do the plan, then we say, here are all the things that you need to consider. So you can keep all these ideas in mind, whether you're talking at the high scale or whether you're talking about individual projects. So I think the most important thing is just to try and, if you think that it's important, just try and pass that information on to other people who you think might also think it's important, or feel free to tell your council members or your planning commissioners and say, hey, we heard this thing, we have this great idea, and we think that it applies to our community, and ask them what they're doing about it. Just behind you. I'll come back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Holly. So you're from Yale, and Yale is the big school back east that I've always known to produce a lot of great communicators and politicians. And you've done a great job of trying to convince us that we should urbanize.
I'm not
and this is
convincing
going to
you
be
of anything.
great density, and we're going to love it, and it's all going to work wonderfully. And I'm just a little bit skeptical.
Okay.
And I'm wondering about things like, well, suppose we go and do this, and we're going to be studying Peary Park, and we're going to study the El Camino Real Precise Plan, And I would imagine that you and I suppose you work for the development community, right? You
No,
work for the development.
I do not work for the development community.
You work for urban planning.
I am a private consultant who comes and answers questions.
Okay.
So I use my expertise on the way cities change and the way markets work in order to say what I think might be good for your community based on the questions that you ask me.
Well, we have a lot of pressure from the developers to densify, and your services would come in there into that fray, and I'm wondering, what's in it for us, really, to go and do this densification? So we go and do this, and I didn't hear you talk at all about, adding all of this density is going to create a tremendous amount of infrastructure cost. And I didn't hear you talk about roads, schools, water, sewer, air quality, or any of those kinds of things. And somebody's going to have to pay for that. And I'm wondering who's going to end up having to pay for that, and what that's going to do to the existing population that has lived here a long time.
Okay?
And what's going to happen to single-family homes in that picture?
Absolutely. I think first I would just say, I feel like I got a lot into an hour, so there's only so much that I can go over. But I would like to perhaps try and clarify or respond to the questions that you asked. I in no way necessarily said, I'm not proposing that Sunnyvale densifies. I think I specifically said that we need to target specific areas that have potential for change that maybe aren't doing well and don't align with the types of lifestyles that people who live in the Bay Area or people who want to live in Sunnyvale might want to have. So I specifically said that areas that are stable and don't need any change, we don't need to change. I specifically said we're not talking about densifying existing stable, low-density residential areas. And we're specifically not talking about adding activity or workplace into those areas. Because I think it's very important that we build off of what is existing and what the community is. That said, I believe that like I said, cities change over time. That's what they do. And if you want to be successful, you have to take into account the forces that are acting on your city and how your city is changing in order to make it the best possible city for who lives there now and who's going to live there in the future. Absolutely, when you build new development, you need infrastructure to go along with it. How that infrastructure gets paid for depends on the type of development and the type of infrastructure that you need. And so, if you're going to, like I said, the Bay Area and Sunnyvale is going to grow. So you need to plan for that growth. That includes schools, that includes infrastructure. Yes, you have to plan for it. What I'm talking about is, as that growth occurs, what's the best kind of growth to have? And the way to have that growth affect your city to either improve your city or to have the least negative impacts possible is to build in a way that aligns with the lifestyles of people that might want to live here, that aligns with current trends in terms of changing how we get around. So if, for example, road infrastructure is something that you're concerned about because of traffic, perhaps. One of the best ways to avoid having to build additional road capacity is to build development in a way that can take advantage of existing and future transit. So, I'm not up here, first of all, I'm not working for the city right now. So I'm not up here saying, this is the plan for your city. I'm not talking about any specific place where any particular kind of development can go. I'm just talking about broad trends that we've done a lot of research on. And I believe that Sunnyvale is well positioned to take advantage of those trends. And some of that is going to require some higher density residential in particular areas that allow people to walk to activity centers or allow people to take transit. And a lot of it is not. So I think that's the way that I would respond to those. I don't know if that responded to all of your concerns, but...
Well, you mentioned transit, and we haven't been notoriously poor at getting any real significant improvements in transit in Sunnyvale. And so we're being asked to believe in this urbanization process that's based around transit, and to believe that the transit will come. And I have just a little bit of skepticism.
I think it's certainly fair to have healthy skepticism about that sort of thing. I think,
And who's going to pay for it?
it comes from many different areas. It's now we're talking about things that me as one person, whether I'm a politician at Sunnyvale, whether I'm a community member, whether I'm a developer, cities are group efforts. They require everybody. They are the politicians, they require the transit providers. We're talking about a lot of changes where things get privatized, so things that used to be the city aren't the city anymore. So if you have concerns about those kinds of things, the only way to handle the concerns is to have a conversation and say, this is the best possible future that we could have. How do we make that happen? If it needs to have transit and you have a concern about how to pay for it, then you say we have a concern about that we're not going to be able to pay for the transit we need in order to support that density, and then you figure out a way to make it happen. But it's not like Sunnyvale is the only community in this boat, or that New York City didn't grow up, it wasn't all of a sudden 80-story buildings or whatever, It started from an agricultural community, and now it has a whole lot of transit and a lot of development. That's not to say that you want to be New York City, it just goes to show that cities change over time, and places that don't have transit can get transit. And in terms of having difficulty getting transit, sure, there's a chicken and egg thing. Do you build the development first, or you build the transit first? Something's got to be built first. And so, I'm not trying to argue with you necessarily. I'm just saying that what my presentation is about broad trends that have been affecting the community for some time and are going to continue to affect the community. And it's important for the community to take those into account in order to make sure that your city is what you want in the future. Yes?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off what you just said there. I'm just Joe, citizen in Sunnyvale. I'm just curious, in terms of when you do your presentations, do you go outside to local city council meetings too, and city planners in the area too, and give your presentations and kind of get ideas that way?
Not generically speaking. I mean, if a city council or a planning commission wants to hear what I have to say, then I will go and give them the information that I have. So generally the way city councils and planning commissions work is they ask for information. If they ask me for information, then I would go and give the presentation. Or I give a presentation like this and it's in a local community, city council and planning commission decides that's of interest to me, and they'll show up and they'll listen to what I have to say. I do talk to planning commissions and city councils when it's part of the project. So at some point I will be talking to the Sunnyvale Planning Commission and Sunnyvale City Council about Perry Park.
Cool. Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a similar question that's like the what's in it for us thing.
Yes, I did not answer that question.
So you're,
sorry.
You're saying you spent a lot of time explaining that in a new digital economy, it's better to have a certain physical landscape to attract that kind of companies and workers. But so what? I mean, we attract the next Facebook. So what? I mean, Facebook now, it's in Menlo Park, and the only reason that Menlo Park gets any money out of that is because they have a special agreement with that company to provide in lieu sales tax, since there's no sales that the city can collect. A similar company, a tech company, if Sunnyvale were to develop by having a walkable, pleasant area, how is it good for Sunnyvale to have companies that don't sell anything that we can go into the general fund with?
I think that what I had hoped I had maybe made a little bit more clear, maybe I didn't. So what the community gets out of it is it gets a community that if you work in Sunnyvale, the place where you go to work is a place that you are happier going to work. When it's more walkable, you have some place that you can go. You have some variety of places that you can go to lunch. The do-it-yourself generation is very engaged in their work activity, and they feel like other people in the workplace district are also engaged in the work activity. Maybe they collaborate with those people. So So for workplace districts in particular, what you would get is you would get the people who work in those workplace districts would have a better experience in the workplace districts. You would also potentially get the people who live nearby or are residents and walk through or visit that workplace district would have a better experience in that workplace district. Similarly, you would have a downtown, whereas previously you have this large auto-oriented mall. And so instead of your downtown being occupied by an auto-oriented mall, you have a more pleasant shopping and entertainment experience. You have a plaza or a central green where the community can hold activities. So what you get out of it is you get places that you are happier to inhabit, that you enjoy better when you're living there or when you're working there or when you're shopping there. And the reason that I focused on the way work changes and the way the world is changing is because those are representative of how we live our lives. And so what I'm talking about simply is saying the way that we've built our cities to date and the community that we inhabit now is based on people living their lives a way which is not the way they live their lives anymore. And that's not everybody, which is why I said we're not talking about changing everything, right? We're just talking about changing the places that are more likely to change and that are more out of sync with the way that we live our lives. Go ahead.
Sunnyvale doesn't have any institutions of higher education, any major medical centers, or any big corporate headquarters.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
How do you see us dealing with that when our neighboring communities all have those facilities? Is it fine that we just rely on them, or should we pick something like Castro Street or University Avenue and say we want that here too?
I'm not an expert on necessarily like anchor facilities like universities or hospitals, so I would say that first off. But I think that, the community would be fine if, I think, just from a regional perspective, so like hospitals are a regional institution. If there's a hospital that's nearby that makes sure that everybody has a hospital to go to, then the community doesn't necessarily have to focus on getting a hospital. If there was an industry in Sunnyvale, if there was an industry cluster in Sunnyvale that could take a lot of advantage of a hospital and there was a site where it could go, then it might make sense for the city to try and approach a hospital and say, hey, we're underserved and we have a site and there's a lot of stuff nearby, and then it might benefit that area. But I think large institutions like hospitals and universities, I would tend to think of them like Google or Facebook. It's a large entity, and that large entity is going to kind of decide where it wants to go, and they're going to make sure that the market is served by what it provides. And so it's not necessarily, you can probably get a lot more bang for your buck focusing on small and medium-sized entities in a variety of industries that are based on the industries that are currently strong in the city of Sunnyvale. In terms of educational institutions, to the extent that you might be able to identify, not necessarily a university, but like a startup school. I actually believe that there maybe is one, there's an incubator in Perry Park. I think there's some activity like that in Sunnyvale in general. And so maybe identifying those types of entities and strengthening them, or identifying ones in the Bay Area in general that you think might make a good fit in Sunnyvale and trying to attract them to have a branch in some particular area in Sunnyvale might make sense. But that would probably be the extent to which any single community has control over some of those larger entities. Yes.
Yeah, a couple of months ago, I learned about a new parameter that I didn't know about. It's called J to ER. Have you ever heard of that?
J-E-R?
No, J to
J2R.
or ER. Jobs to employed residents.
Oh, the jobs housing balance.
Yes. So For example, I live in Mountain View, and I believe that ratio is 1.44. Palo Alto is 2.68. The entire peninsula, I believe, is something like 1.44, which means there's more jobs than there are available housing units to house people. So therefore, that explains why our freeways are jammed. Caltrain is pretty close to being maxed out. You just can't hardly get any, and there's a need for white buses to drive from San Francisco. It'd be even worse if they didn't do that. So when you start peeling back the onion, you begin to figure that these cities are motivated to build more office space than they are housing, because people live in houses, they have kids, they need schools, they need police, they need fire. It's a lot easier just to build an office park, and that generates a lot more tax revenue than it does tax expenditures. So I wonder if you could address, and I think it might all get back to Proposition 13 and the way our whole tax code in California is structured. So that's one problem. Just put that aside for a
I
second.
can't solve the property tax problem.
Yeah. So if cities are driven to build more offices than houses, are we all doomed? Okay,
You know,
before you answer that, let me ask my second question, which is what I call the bubble factor. I live very close to Google, and when somebody gets in a white bus in San Francisco, they step into the bubble, and they don't step out of the bubble until they step off that bus later that night. In other words, they don't, as you mentioned, they don't buy lunch. Their dry cleaning is taken care of where they work. They have daycare. They have everything is provided for them in the bubble. They have no need to go outside that. So they don't generate any sales tax by buying lunches and buying clothes or buying whatever out in the community. They're basically in a sealed bubble. And Facebook's pretty much like that. Apple's very much like that. So in this area, we have this bubble factor where you have these huge multi-billion-dollar companies that generate very little tax revenue, yet they have tens of thousands of employees that are using this infrastructure, including and consuming electricity, et cetera, but they're not generating the revenue that you would normally have from something that sells something that's tangible that you can actually tax. So I wonder if you could address that issue.
Sure.
So those are two questions.
Yes, two questions. Let me start with the second one. That, I think, relates very closely to a lot of what I said, which is I feel like it's important for any kind of development to be well integrated into the community. The extent to which you have private cafes in campuses, or you have development which is not integrated into you're talking about like a workplace campus that's not integrated into the larger district, that's what I was saying, where the campus isn't contributing to the larger community, and the campus isn't getting the benefit of what the larger community could contribute to it. So I think that I feel that those companies would be even more well served if they were integrated in the community than if they had that bubble factor. I feel pretty strongly about that. I think that community should push as hard as possible to not allow those kind of inwardly focused, totally privatized campuses. They look like they have a lot of great public space, but it's not really public, it's just internal space. And it's organized so that people who go to work there can't integrate with the larger community. So I completely agree with you about that. In terms of the being incentivized, feeling like you're incentivized to build office, I think that, first of all, there's some confusion in the fact that the belief that, we make all of our money off of sales tax and housing doesn't pay its way. Mixed use and higher density housing can provide at least as much, if not more, funds to general funds than low density commercial development can. So there are lots of there are not lots, I wouldn't say, but there are a good number of studies recently, because that question comes up frequently, especially planning city councils in particular. Looking back, like I said, suburbanization it was about having more retail land and getting more retail sales tax, and just, you want a Target and you want something that generates a lot of retail sales tax. But even large anchored shopping centers that are auto-oriented and surface parked don't actually generate significantly more tax revenue per acre of land than higher density development does when you include the property taxes and such. And there's no, I can't give you like a specific like, well, 3-story housing is equivalent to X, because it depends on the community you're in. But that's just one important thing to keep in mind, that it's a little bit of a myth that housing doesn't pay its way. It depends on the kind of development that you're talking about, and the density and the property values. So I think that another thing that I would say to that is, in terms of the way our work lives and our lifestyles are changing, we're not traveling as far on a daily basis. So like I said, our regions are becoming polynucleated. They're becoming more and more sub-regional. So as time goes on, people are they're not going to do as much of the commute from San Francisco to Sunnyvale, or from Sunnyvale to wherever. They're going to be commuting shorter and shorter distances. That's one of the things you get out of providing the types of housing and living environments in Sunnyvale that people are living in San Francisco for, is that they don't have to live in San Francisco, they can live in Sunnyvale. And now you don't have to travel as far in order to get to work. And those people want to have a convenient commute. I mean, it may be nice in some senses to not have to worry to sleep or start working on the bus as you commute down to Google from San Francisco. But I know a lot of people who do that, and they don't like it. They like a lot of things about the amenities that Google provides them, but they would much rather have Google be located in San Francisco, or have some place in Mountain View that they felt like was as nice as where they live in San Francisco. So I think that it would be much more beneficial to look at things in this global way, and recognize that you're not really incentivized to just build office. You're incentivized to build a better community, and that includes better places to work and better places, but not better necessarily, because there's plenty of room for a lot of the single-family home neighborhoods that people live in, and they want to live in those neighborhoods, but choices for other types of places to live.
Eric, I wonder,
Yes.
we're at an hour and 40 minutes, so maybe I was wondering, one more question and then you'll be available afterwards? Or would people like to stay together for another 15 minutes and do Q&A?
15 minutes.
15 minutes together? Okay.
Sure, yes.
Yeah, I think it's good to have the mixed neighborhood and offices, housing, everything together. But the Ferry Park development specifically, and Sunnyvale in general, doesn't have that much space to do all these things. If you look at that mod corridor, previously there used to be just single floor office buildings where few hundred employees or maybe 1,000 employees used to come. Now we are building all these high rises, which are going to bring like maybe 10,000 employees. We have LinkedIn, we have Apple coming in, we have a hospital, and then there is a riverbed building. So the access to all these offices is through either Matilda or Mary or through Central. And we have all these thousands of people from morning like 7 to 9 coming to these neighborhoods, commuting here. But at the same time, the families living around the neighborhood, they are trying to get the kids to the schools and all. It's going to cause a lot of congestion. And also to have a lifestyle that is desirable for everyone. Actually, I mean, there is not that much area to build all kinds of things that you want to build so that you can attract this big general population. So that's just what I wanted to
Just a
comment.
statement. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I will keep that in mind for the Perry Park project. That's I hand over here.
How does this model maintain or increase public space in proportion to population growth?
One of the ways, so it doesn't necessarily, like for example, a very dense city has generally has less open space per resident. And I don't necessarily have like specific ratios off the top of my head, but I would guess that like New York City has less open space per resident than San Francisco does. And San Francisco probably has, I mean, it has Golden Gate Park, but you know. But I think that what you want to have happen is you want each increment of development to add to the network of public space. So smaller developments will, but especially in areas that you have higher density or mixed use, you have more flexibility in your site plan when you have higher density development, let me put it that way. So you can, especially like if you have, as soon as you go to structured parking, then you're basically freeing up land that you otherwise would have had cars on for open space. So that's kind of the direct trade-off that you get when you have different kinds of development, is as soon as you go to structured parking, then the space that or especially underground parking, the space that would have been taken up by parking is taken up by public space, landscaping. But I mean, I don't, that seems like that didn't answer your question from your reaction.
No. Well, it's a no.
I mean, public space is very important to me, and I think that what auto-oriented developments typically don't have is public space. So I think the most clear comparison that I can make is to say that if you go out, you're going to have existing zoning in community, and it's going to permit a certain type of development, and most likely it's going to permit some kind of auto-oriented office, for example. And that kind of auto-oriented office is not going to be providing any open space.
So you're saying it's less worse?
No, not that it's less worse. If you replace cities, the entire Bay Area is already built out. Okay, so we're not growing anywhere. We're growing on top of ourselves. So if we want to make our communities better, we have to make what we have on the ground better than what it is now. In whatever way better is for you. Okay, so if you think that the places that we work are terrible, we need new workplace environments, then you have to replace your old workplace environments with new workplace environments. If you think that you don't have enough public space, then you have to replace something with public space. And for a built-out community, one of the only ways that you can get more public space is by replacing some area that's low density and doesn't have public space with something that's higher density and that has public space mixed in the back.
I just, we have this desire apparently is to become more urban, particularly along the main arterials, but I don't see, as we replace these one-story buildings, both residential and commercial, with 5- and 6-story buildings, I don't see any plan, any even the slightest indication that you're going to put another lane on the street. The street grid is fixed, and they're leaving it fixed, and they're full now. Now, it's nice to put in a parking garage. It does free up surface space, because you got cars on multiple levels, but sooner or later they emerge and fill up the street, and then nobody can move.
Only if everybody in there owns a car and is driving.
Not everybody. 75%. If you got 5 levels of people where there used to be 1, and that's throughout the town, or at least along the main
yes, but if 70% of your trips are for personal and recreational reasons, and a whole bunch of those trips are like going to the grocery store, and everybody in that 6-story building can walk a block and get groceries on the corner instead of having to drive 3 miles in order to go to the supermarket, then you're getting cars off the road. So I would not stand up here and say that everybody in that building is not going to own a car and they're not going to drive to work necessarily. But What I'm saying is cities change over time, and you have to make that change be something that helps solve your problems. And you won't solve a traffic problem by building more low-density auto-oriented development, because low-density auto-oriented development will only get you more traffic, whereas concentrated higher density, and that doesn't necessarily mean high-rises, but it just means concentrated higher density near where there's transit, will get you more transit use and less traffic than you would get if you had built more low-density auto-oriented development.
So have you done studies with that? I mean, because when they built those houses next to the railroad track, they said, oh, we think it's because, it's going to really have a lot of people using the railroad. Is a study done on that? I don't think there's any studies been done on that.
There are lots of transportation studies about transit use and density. I don't know if there are any studies specifically about developments in Sunnyvale, but there are way more than you will ever have time or be interested in reading in terms of
I'd be interested
transit
in learning
studies.
about Sunnyvale, because
But I'm not a traffic engineer.
Okay.
But I do know I work with a lot of traffic engineers, so I generally get a lot of my information from traffic engineers.
So people who live next to the railroad don't have cars then, they just use the railroad?
No, that's not necessary. It doesn't mean that everybody who lives near a train station does not have a car. That is definitely not what it means. What it means is that you're more likely to use the train if you live near the train and you can walk to the train. And that is extremely well documented. It's different depending on whether you're living there or working there, how far from the train you're likely to walk to the train. And for example, like BART, if you have in the middle of a freeway and you have a big parking structure that has plenty of parking that you can drive to, you're not likely to walk to that station. So there's a lot of factors that come into whether or not that station is going to be used. For example, with Caltrain, you have the Baby Bullet versus the local express. And so the stations that have the Baby Bullet service get significantly more use than the local trains do. So there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not people in that particular house or development are going to be using the station nearby. But definitely stations that have more people within walking distance of the station will get more use. And people who live near a station are significantly more likely to use the transit than if they don't live near a station.
And by the way, there's a brand new study coming out that might be interesting to this community. The nonprofit Transform did a study specifically related to parking in areas near transit that have transit passes, and how much is the building's parking used. Because one of the common things that people say, in theory, well, it should need less parking, but people worry that, okay, well, everybody's going to have a car and drive anyway. Is that theory true? And so they actually did an empirical study. There's one anecdote I know off the top of my head, but I can bring in the people that did the study and they can present that. For example, there's an apartment building called Madera in Mountain View, and there was a big to-do in the city that it wasn't going to have enough parking, and they did a study afterward and found that 30% of the parking is empty in this building. And similarly, there was a building in Palo Alto. The other one is residential. There's one in Palo Alto that is a commercial building, a lot of worry, not enough parking, and the company moving in has only a third of its employees driving. The building is located right next to the Caltrain station. And we'll be happy to work with Barbara and bring in that study here.
Thank you. Put your hand up for a while, sure.
So when we look at major employers in Sunnyvale, and you do the spider about where people commute to them, the largest commute routes are from San Francisco and San Jose, and then you look at the other bigger towns, and they have more people, and then that's the next group of people, and it's a spider that goes out from that employer. And so what you're suggesting is that if you build on transit, that this spider is going to come in more. But if we're building 4 times the density, then you'd have to have a factor of 4 times the number of people that come in to, you know, to that employer or use that transit. And I don't know that those studies would uphold something that dramatic. And so my question is, there is a question in this, and that's, why can't we build what you're suggesting in terms of this mixed-use development at the same density that it's replacing? Why do we have to add the square feet? What's the logical reason for that?
Okay, forgetting the name of the website, but actually the distance that people are commuting to Sunnyvale is not as extreme as you think that it is. When we looked at Peary Park, it was actually within 10 miles, I believe, is the large majority of employees in Peary Park are only commuting 10 miles. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that actually, in terms of the trends that I was talking about people traveling less, that actually in Sunnyvale, in Peary Park in particular, I can't necessarily speak to the other areas because I haven't looked at the data, but that people are not actually traveling as far as you might think that they are. Now, the reason you could, how do I answer that question? There's 2 parts to answering that question. First of all, you have development regulations in place that allow a certain amount of development on any particular property in the city. And it's fairly likely that it's likely that a lot of places, the development regulations allow more intensity than what is currently on a site. So without changing the policies that you have, it's fairly likely that anybody who owns a particular property can go in and tear something down and build something more intense, because that's what your land use regulations currently allow. Okay? So if you wanted to change that, then you would have to downsize the zoning on those properties to match what's currently on those properties. So that's the first thing to just keep in mind. Okay? Now, if you decided as a community that we like exactly the density that we're at everywhere, and you ensconce that into your general plan and said, we don't want to intensify, then what you're saying is we're not going to grow at all. And I believe that if you basically don't grow at all, you're going to stagnate and you're not going to be a successful community. Let me answer your question. I'm just giving you my opinion. Okay. So the other reason is that there's a feasibility aspect involved. It costs a certain amount of money in order to tear something down and build something new, and the land values in this area are extraordinarily high. So it's fairly unlikely that you will get, not that you won't get any development necessarily, but you will restrict a certain amount of change if you only allow people to replace a certain density with the same density again. Just because the cost of tearing it down and building something new there's no incentive. I can make the same amount of money off of the space that I already have. Why would I invest and build something new? So that doesn't say that as a community you can't decide that's what you want to do. I'm just saying that if you did decide that's what you wanted to do, what would likely happen is there would be a lot of properties that would not change. And if what you want is not change, then okay, you would be accomplishing that. And you would, so you basically, you would get what you have.
We would slow down pace of growth, is what we would do.
You wouldn't necessarily change the traffic on the freeway. The Bay Area is growing. I mean, you can't, or the people are moving in, people are having babies. I personally believe, and you may not agree with me, but I believe that cities all over the country and the world have been growing for a very long time, and I think what we want to do is acknowledge that if people want to live and work in our community, we should try and make it possible for them to live and work in our community in a way that makes everybody happy. And I believe that there are aspects of the Sunnyvale community that people who live in this community would probably wish were better than they are. And the only way to make them better is to change them. And changing them is going to be relatively market-based because you have to have people who want to invest money into a certain kind of product. And if you restrict your regulations so that they don't allow stuff that's feasible, then you're not going to get any change. So if it's totally up to the community to decide how much and what kind of change you want. But if you want change, you should take into account these large forces of change that the city, Sunnyvale can't stop those forces from happening. They are happening. So I think your best bet is to decide what it is that you do want, which I'm not proposing to you what Sunnyvale should do. I'm just telling you what these forces are, and the fact that if there are any aspects of your community that you want to make better, then you should take these forces into account and focus on the areas that you can and want to make better.